Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you want to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today, we are doing chapter 88 of Breaking Step. What's wrong? Jekyll asked, turning to stone as Tibs froze. Tibs sensed the fog, tried to push further than it reduced it. But this was... Yeah, that doesn't stop. Push past. Well, the thing is, I don't know how to better to say it, because that, like, it's not like there's a limit. It's just that a sense can't push past. Yeah. Tim sensed the fog, tried to push further than it reduced it, but this was different from the one Ganny had filled the third floor with. The fog is back, he whispered, trying to understand what it meant. Are you sure? Don asked. Tip stared at the sorcerer. Can't you sense it? You could before. Don closed his eyes and soon after shook his head. Was that what was different about it? This targeted his sense specifically? What does it mean for the run? Jekyll asked. I think the real question is, why did it return now? Don said. And how we need to deal with it for the run. Jekyll snapped. If Tibbs can't sense anything, we have to change our strategies. I still can. He tried to get a sense of how far he could reach. 2 blocks for sure, maybe 3. It's not as uniform as it was on the third floor. Is that why none of the golem people have magic? Mez asked. The dungeon was keeping it for this? Possibly, Don answered, rubbing his temple. There are too many unknowns. We can keep going, Tibbs said. The doorways have always opened close enough. I'll still be able to sense them. And 2 blocks is enough to prepare for the approaching guards. How about the dogs? Jekyll asked. Can you still sense them? There aren't any now, but I should be able to. They're strong enough, their essence is dense. Just stay on guard for them while we continue. The library was large enough, Tips couldn't sense it completely. They passed 2 blocks of houses before reaching the door, and and the road can. Oh, no, okay, no, it and the building. Oh, they passed 2 blocks of houses before reaching the door, and it continued far past it. What the bleep was I talking about here? I know what I mean, but okay, they passed 2 blocks. Okay. So they walked alongside the road. The building is there. They walked alongside the road for 2 blocks. Okay. Ah, they walked along Sandy. For 2 blocks before reaching the door. It continued as far past it. Okay, that's a little. Da, 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 da. Columns of darker stone. A double door. All right. Let's see if this works better. If this works well. The library was large enough, Tibbs couldn't sense it completely. They walked along the sandy-colored stone of its wall for 2 blocks of houses before reaching the doors, and it continued as far past it. Columns of darker stone had gone up between the windows, as well as on each side of the double door, up to the 3 stories, and seemed to support the roof. Is it safe to go in? Don asked, grinning the way Jackal did when loot was in sight. There were no essence triggers, and looking over the lock, hinges, and frame did not reveal traps. Neither reassured it. Neither? There's more than lock, hinges, frame. Yeah. Neither would imply. Neither is usually used only for 2 items. It didn't reassure him. With the fog targeting him specifically, he couldn't know what else it kept him from sensing. He had sensed the triggers within the houses, as well as the golem people that had waited in ambush, but was that to let him think his sense wasn't affected that way? Or was it Ganny trying? Okay, was that? No. Okay, was that because his sense wasn't affected that way? Or was it Ganny trying to trick him? He grabbed the door's handle before Don could, glaring at the sorcerer. When he tested with a pull, the door creaked open, and dry, dusty air pushed out. It was enough unlike any of the other buildings that he looked at Don, who sniffed, smiled, and squeezed into the gap, vanishing inside as Jackal ordered him to stay. Tibs didn't rush in after the sorcerer. Don knew better, and if a trap caught him, he could wait until Tibs made sure they weren't others as he made his way to him. The entryway was the size of the inn. The floor was the same sandy stone as outside, but polished until the light stones on the columns supporting the ceiling reflected on it. The walls were close enough to white Tibbs could imagine purity having been applied to the sandy color until it became this. Painting of people lined the 2 walls, demarcating the entryway. Unlike the golem people they had fought, what Tibbs made out of them. Okay, let's quantify this. Faded paintings. Unlike the golem people they had fought, what Tibbs made out of them was lanky and thin. Pale color for the skin and hair. The frame had been painted in gold, which was peeling. He wondered who they were. They'd all figured the short gray skin. They'd all decided the short gray-skinned golem people had been who lived in the city, but there had been the question of why the houses seemed made for regular people. Were they Stowe's creation, and these lanky people who had lived? Were they Stowe's creation? Were they Stowe's creation? These lanky. Oh, okay. They Stowe's creation. Were they Stowe's creation? What about these lanky? These lanky people. paintings. Had they lived here? Who? Instead? If so, then why had the furniture been pushed down? Um, okay, why was the furniture down to the size of the golem people? They'd all decided the short, gray-skinned golem people had been who lived in the city, but there had been the... Okay, this is going to be... But there had been the question of why the houses seemed made for regular people. Were they Stowe's creation? What about these lanky people in the painting? Had they lived here too, instead? If so, then why was the furniture down to the size of the golem people? Don's yell of joy pulled him out of the puzzle. Why didn't any trap I walked in made me that happy? Jekyll grumbled. Maybe the trap buried him in books. Maz offered as Tibs followed the footsteps in the dust, clearing it to make sure there weren't traps the sorceress had stepped over. There weren't any by the time Tibs made it to the opposite archway. He looked over his shoulder at the entryway, more portrait between the windows, each someone lanky. There was a lot of floor that could hide triggers under the dust, but other than stepping off this path to study the paintings, there was no reason to have traps there. Whenever Stowe spoke to him again, Tibs was going to let him know how little he enjoyed having him play with his nerves like this. He isn't buried, Jekyll grumbled, and Tibs looked into the large room. Don sat on a table, an open tome in his lap, and more stacked next to him. 3 such tables, devoid of sorcerer and books, were next to it, with enough space for chairs and someone to walk between them. Then, bookshelves filled with books, and he sensed more behind them and going as far as his sense reached ahead of him. And on the balcony above them, as well as on the balcony above them. Above the sorcerer, a glowing orb provided light for him to read by. He looked up, grinning. How many books can you fit in your pouch? Why? Jekyll replied cautiously. Don motioned around them. I need to bring them back to study. What did they say? Tibs asked, stepping into the sorcerer's step, then pausing as an orb appeared over his head. I don't know, Don replied while Tibs studied the weave of the orb. It uses the arcanas, but arranged in a way I've never seen before. And there are 2 characters I also don't know. It was light essence, nearly exclusively so, with just a hint of air, maybe to keep it afloat. The filigree were simpler than he expected, and he memorized them as best as he could. This might be something he could only do in the privacy of his room, but not having to bother with candles or willing the essence to remain would make working there easier. If they even say anything, Mez said, and Tibs realized he'd missed most of what Don had said. They might just be things the dungeon made to mess with you. Sorcerers, I mean. Don raised the tome. Tibs looking at Tibs. They aren't woven with essence, but that doesn't mean he didn't make them. The normal armor and clothing don't have essence in them, and we know he made those. The only thing he weaves essence in are those he doesn't want destroyed. Other than by you, Jekyll said. He doesn't want me to destroy them either, Tibs replied. Don pushed himself off the table and offered the tome to Jekyll, who stepped back, hands raised. Put that in your pouch, the sorcerer said. We're starting with those 2 bookcases. He motioned to the ones on their left and right. If they're arranged the same way as back home, those are the core primer regarding the subjects, plural, contained in the rest of the library, and they will have the ordering scale that makes finding them easier. You have a backpack, the fighter stated. I can't fit all those books in it, Don replied dismissively. Your pouch can hold everything in here, so no, it can't. Jekyll said, glaring at Tibs. Some people argued for it to have a limit. Supposedly, so I wouldn't leave the dungeon with everything not attached to the floor and wall, Mez added, earning himself the fighter's glare. And ceiling, Tibbs said, distracted by something he couldn't quite make out within his sense. It was like the fog had shifted. He suffused himself with darkness, and his vision filled with secrets. Fear made him swallow. Was he back in that realm of secret Kamdar had told him about? Then he realized they had no shape. They were just clouds enveloping the books. All of them. If what he sensed was a secret, then he was lost. Then he was lost among those. Suffusing himself with light didn't help. There were no lies here. Did that mean the books were real? Guys, Mez said, but Don and Jackal kept arguing about the value of the books here. Guys, be quiet! Tibbs looked at the archer, losing track of his own search. I think I hear something, he said in the following silence. Without the voices, and Tibbs not so focused on his sense, he heard it too. The slow shuffling of approaching steps. He sensed in that direction, but the fog was... Guards? Jekyll whispered, moving next to Tibbs, his skin gray. Those don't sound like boots, Mez whispered behind Tibbs. Does the library have guards? Tibbs asked Dawn on his other side. Some of them might come in to read, the sorcerer whispered in his answer, but books aren't something thieves usually go after. You think this is a dungeon respecting the theme, like he did with the permit building? Didn't you say this wasn't a dungeon-made building? Mez asked, and Tibbs nodded. That is not to say the dungeon is incapable of making use of an already existing structure, Kamdar whispered, staff in hand. After all, there is essence here as within any ordinary or dungeon-made place. And these are just going to be scholar? Jekyll asked, disappointed. Golem people, Tibbs said, made to look like scholar, but that sounded wrong to his ears. There, Mez whispered, pointing in the darkened distance. Tibbs realized only the 5 of them had orbs of lights over them. The forms he could just make out, stout and wide, were bathed in darkness. How dangerous can scholars be? And why bother hiding? Jekyll asked. And why bother hiding them from his sense? I mean, unless they throw books, the fighter added in the silence, then this will be a dungeon worthy of the abyss. It's worse than that, Don said. Tibbs ignored the certainty in his voice. Whatever etching it was that they used, it's something to the fog around them, made it less something. He didn't have time to come up with a word, but it was clear they were doing it, and abyss. His sense shattered at the realization. They're sorcerers, aren't they? Don asked. I think so. The etching hiding them uses multiple essences. Oh, Jekyll said, all dismissiveness in his voice gone. How many? Too many, Mez replied. By the sound, there could be more than a dozen of them. How strong are they? Don asked. I can't sense them, Tibbs replied, but it wouldn't matter. Golem people aren't like us. I can just tell the kind of essence they use. So they could just be Epsilon? Jekyll asked, hopefully. Not on the 4th floor of a dungeon, Mez replied. Don replied as as one of the forms became visible at the edge of their light, but on the balcony instead of among those still approaching. Around the tables. Around the tables. What Tibbs made out was the gray skin and compressed form, but their hair was thin and white, and the skin wrinkled. Old, the combination said to him. Other Another appeared next to it, and they both reached the rail, and this one had a beard so long that as it leaned forward to look at them, it fell over and hung below their floor. Another stepped next to them, as Tibs caught motion on the other balcony, where five stepped onto the edge of their light. And now he could make out enough detail from those among the tables to count heads. They'd been right. A dozen, which meant there were 1 in 9 sorcerers around them. I really hope they're Epsilon, Miss whispered. We need to leave, Don said, before they can focus on anything. He sent corruption at those among the table. Tibs channeled lightning. He knew from experience how hard it made thinking, even when it barely caused damage. He sent it at those on the left balcony, leaving it to jump between the golems as he sensed fire essence being etched. He channeled that and pulled on the etching hard, undoing it and adding that essence to his reserve. Don't use the books, Don yelled. They're priceless. Jekyll was throwing those on the table, each hit sending one golem to its back, onto its back, but not keeping them there. The dungeon is going to remake them overnight, the fighter replied, throwing the last one. Tibs, can you absorb all their etching? He motioned for them to step back toward the archway. Tibs willed the etching he sensed forming, but the golems were too strong for that. One dropped as a fire arrow exploded in their chest. The next one was doused by water before it reached another. I have to be channeling that element, otherwise I have nowhere to pull the essence into. He channeled lightning and pulled that essence into him before the bolt reached his friend, but with it focused on that, metal and water, in the form of Spike and Ice, were on their way. Darkness intercepted them, but they had enough as they hit that Dawn staggered and Maz cursed. Might I recommend we make haste, the cleric said through pain-clenched teeth. If we turn our back to them, Jekyll said, they're going to cut us down. Tibs? He had a moment of annoyance that Jekyll looked to him again for a solution. He made a wall of ice that broke, intercepting the stone, and dissolved more metal Spike with corruption. He could hold them back while his team escaped, and then he would. What he needed was a way to block the sorcerers that didn't leave him behind. He used air to send bookshelves flying at the sorcerer, but only the books cut in the air, and he had no control over how they flew and most hit columns instead of the sorcerer. And Jekyll, break that column. He had no idea if it was going to work. Everyone else, cover us. He ran to the one under the opposite balcony, suffusing himself with earth and making himself as hard and strong as he could. He punched a column and sent chunks flying. Jekyll! He called when he didn't hear the corresponding hit from the fighter's side. A glance over his shoulder showed him the fighter with both hands against the column, pushing essence into it. Tibs cursed. Of course he didn't have to hit it. There was more to earth than making himself harder and stronger. He pushed essence into the existing cracks within the column and used that to push it apart. The snap of breaking stone came from Jekyll's side first, then the ground shook and stone rained down as his finally broke, exploding instead of just breaking. When he ran for his friends already making their way to the archway, keeping the stone from falling on them. They made it out just ahead of the cloud of stone dust and continued running until they were on the other side of the road. He turned, panting, or a sense ready, lightning crackling between his fingers for any sorcerers who made it out. Then his attention was pulled up in awe and horror as the entire building collapsed in on itself. This wouldn't have happened if you'd just taken the books. Of course it would have, Jekyll replied dismissively. They didn't hear us argue. There was some trap you probably triggered by running in without having Tibs make sure it was clear. At least I kept you from pulling us any deeper. Like any of it was about keeping us safe, Don snapped. You're just an arrogant fighter scared of anything that might show him better ways of thinking. Jekyll snorted. You say that like there's something wrong with how I think. Will you two stop? Mez yelled and groaned. Tibs pulled his attention away from the ruin and now breaking and how breaking two columns might have caused it. He cursed and ran to the archer. Keep watch in case they keep watch in case they weren't destroyed. He crouched next to Mez and formed a weave of purity. Sorry, I should have let the building falling keep. I shouldn't have let the building falling keep me from checking on you. I'm not dying, Tibs. It's fine. Mez had some deep cuts, but while many channels were ruptured, they weren't leaking a lot of essence. He sensed for Dawn and Kumdar while he applied the weave, and while neither of them showed it, their injuries were as severe as the archers. After applying weaves to them also, he joined Jekyll in watching the ruins for potential attacks. This isn't my fault, Jekyll stated after the long silence. You could stop playing at hating books so hard. I'm not playing. Books are bad. Tibs rolled his eyes. You don't like books. It doesn't make them bad. I remember this friend of mine, Jekyll said wistfully, who, not so long ago, would run away at the mere mention of learning his letters. Wonder what happened to him. He got over his fear, Tibs answered, because it was what he had to do to help as many people as he could, so he could help his team. Tibs faced his friend. You don't have to learn your letters, Jekyll, but you have to stop getting in the way of Don when he wants books. They're probably not even real books. Maybe, but that's not what matters. Don likes books. If he'd gotten one of them out, he wouldn't be angry right now. Jekyll stared at the remnant of the library, then turned with a huff and headed for the sorcerer. I'm sorry for being an arrogant fighter scared of books. If you want, I'll go in there and get you one. Don looked around the fighter, and Tibs shrugged. He hadn't expected Jekyll to do that. He just hoped he wouldn't cause problem next time. It's okay, the sorcerer said. Like Miss said, they'll be back on our next run. He poked the fighter in the chest. But I am filling your pouch with them. Tibs didn't catch Jekyll's grumbled reply. How come the whole building fell? Tibs asked Don. I don't know. Poor structure, Jekyll replied. The columns didn't just support that balcony, but the one above it, and so on. When we broke them, the other columns had to hold more weight, and they failed. The smile grew on his face as they stared at him in silence. What? You think this is the first building I made come crashing down on my head? How about we take a rest? Even if they survive, they probably can't leave the room. But it's not a dungeon-made building, as said, pulling an ale skin from his pack. It didn't stop the dungeon from using it as one, Don said, wrapping the wheel of cheese. It also makes more sense of creatures staying within... It also makes more sense that creatures staying within the room is a result of the dungeon wanting us to know what to expect instead of something that's intrinsic to the room. But on the previous floor, Jekyll said, taking the loaf of bread from his pouch, we had to make it through each room to continue. Here, we're wandering about until we find the right building. Tibbs made a platter and tinkered over the ice, and Kumdar placed a chunk of cured meat on it. Tibbs added the dried fruit, and they stacked slices of cheese, meats, and fruits on bread. I think you're wrong about wandering about, Don said, swallowing. The dungeon always arranged things so that being smart helps. I think that if we decide to go over the permit building again and any other the dungeon added, we'll find clues as to where the boss room will be located. Jekyll smiled. So what you're saying is that we really should go to the permit building again and collect all that loot. Don stared at the fighter. had a shudder, and nodded. Then he muttered, "I'm staying in the middle of that carpet." And that concludes chapter 88 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story as well as the other in the series, they are up for free on Royal Road. If you want to read ahead of that and support me in the process, that is on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the note. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.